Sometimes life doesn't fall apart to break us. It falls apart to guide us towards something we never knew we needed. In a dusty corner of a forgotten town, a humble mechanic and a woman who seemed to have everything would cross paths in the most unlikely of ways. Neither of them knew it yet, but that brief encounter would set off a chain of events that would challenge everything they thought they understood about success, sacrifice, and the quiet, stubborn power of real love. Stay with us, because some journeys aren't mapped by the roads we take, but by the hearts we find along the way. Before we dive into this heartfelt story, if you enjoy uplifting tales about resilience, kindness, and unexpected love, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories that bring warmth, hope, and a little bit of magic into your day. Now settle in and let's begin. The afternoon sun cast a weary glow over Willow Creek, a town so small that everyone knew not just your name, but also the number of freckles on your nose. Dust swirled lazily along the main street where Evan Carter wiped his hands on an old rag, staring at the truck he'd been patching up since morning. His garage, Carter's Repairs, was a squat, weather-beaten building with peeling blue paint and a sagging roof that threatened to collapse at the next strong wind. Yet it stood, much like Evan himself, stubborn, worn, but somehow still standing. Evan glanced at the clock hanging above the workbench. 5 o'clock. Most people were heading home to warm dinners and families. For him, it was just another evening spent alone among the scent of motor oil and iron. He leaned against the truck, the weight of the day pressing heavy on his back. Inside the pocket of his overalls, the crumpled notice from the bank felt heavier than it should. 60 days to settle the overdue payments or risk losing the garage. The only thing he had left of his father. His thumb brushed over the worn edges of the paper, as if touch alone could erase the reality. From across the street, Mrs. Donnelly waved. The elderly widow ran the town's diner and never missed a chance to check on him. Evan managed a smile and a nod, tucking the paper deeper into his pocket. "You're burning daylight, Evan," she called teasingly. "Guess I'm just stubborn," he replied with a chuckle, though the laughter didn't quite reach his tired eyes. The truth was, Evan had always been stubborn. He'd stayed behind in Willow Creek when everyone else left, turned down scholarships, turned down opportunities because someone needed to stay and look after his kid sister, Sarah. She was off at college now, trying to become the first Carter to get a degree, and Evan wouldn't let his struggles weigh her down. Still, some days the weight of sacrifice pressed harder than others. Just as he was about to close up shop, he heard the unmistakable sound of a car sputtering desperately down the road. Evan turned his head in time to see a sleek, black luxury sedan, wildly out of place in dusty Willow Creek, limping toward his garage, trailing a plume of smoke. The car barely made it into the driveway before dying altogether. Evan dropped his rag and jogged over. He approached carefully as the driver's door swung open. Out stepped a woman who looked like she belonged in a glossy New York magazine, not in a town where the biggest event was the annual chili cook-off. She was stunning in an understated way. Sharp navy suit, hair twisted into a neat chignon, pearl earrings glinting under the fading sunlight. Her high heels crunched awkwardly against the gravel, and the expression on her face was a mix of irritation and helplessness. "Engine trouble?" Evan asked, keeping his voice even, unbothered by the expensive aura she carried. "You think?" she shot back, then immediately winced at her own sharpness. She pressed her fingers to her temple and exhaled. "I'm sorry. It's been a long day." "No harm done," Evan said with an easy smile. "Let's take a look." He popped the hood and immediately spotted the problem. Overheated radiator. Probably a cracked hose too. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to strand someone unfamiliar with the quirks of old engines. "You're lucky you made it this far," he said, wiping his hands again. "This car needs some TLC." The woman sighed, looking truly lost for the first time. "How long do you think it'll take?" "Depends. Could be a few hours if I've got the parts. If not, overnight." She groaned softly. "Perfect." Evan suppressed a smile. "You can wait at the diner across the street. Mrs. Donnelly makes a mean apple pie." The woman hesitated, then offered a hand. "Olivia Montgomery." Evan took it, his calloused fingers brushing her manicured ones. "Evan Carter." Their eyes met briefly, hers guarded, his steady, and for a heartbeat, something unspoken passed between them. She cleared her throat and withdrew her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I appreciate the help." "Just Evan," he said, "and it's no trouble. That's what we do around here. Help when we can." As Olivia walked toward the diner, Evan watched her go, the sinking sun turning her silhouette to gold. She was a puzzle he hadn't expected to stumble across that day, and somehow he had the feeling that fixing her car might be the least complicated part of the evening. He shook off the thought and turned back to the engine. Work first, questions later. Inside the garage, Evan found the replacement hose he needed, an old part, but still serviceable. As he worked, he let his mind drift for a moment. What was a woman like her doing in a place like this? Dressed like that? Driving a car like that? Willow Creek wasn't on any important map. By the time the stars began to prick the darkening sky, Evan had the engine patched and purring again. He closed the hood with a satisfying thud and wiped the grease from his hands. When Olivia returned, she carried a takeout bag in one hand and 2 coffee cups in the other. "I figured you might want one," she said, offering a cup with an awkward smile. Evan accepted it, surprised. "Thanks." They stood for a moment under the buzzing porch light, 2 unlikely strangers sharing coffee over a half-dead car. It was a small kindness, but for Evan it felt like something more. A reminder that even in the hardest places, little moments of grace could still find their way through. "So," Olivia said slowly, staring into her cup, "I might need your help with something else too." Evan raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Her eyes lifted to meet his, steady and serious. "I need a husband," she said bluntly. "Just for a week." The cup nearly slipped from Evan's hand. "Come again." Olivia smiled, a little rueful, a little daring. "It's complicated." And just like that, Evan Carter's life, so carefully built on simple truths and quiet resilience, began to shift, one unexpected heartbeat at a time. Evan leaned against the workbench, coffee cup forgotten in his hand. He watched Olivia carefully, weighing whether he had misheard or if she truly meant what she had just said. "A husband?" he repeated, skeptical. Olivia set her own coffee down on the hood of her car, the slightest edge of embarrassment coloring her otherwise composed demeanor. She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small human gesture that made her seem less like a fortress and more like a woman under siege. "Yes," she said, crossing her arms tightly across her chest as if bracing herself. "A husband. Temporarily." Evan blinked, half expecting her to laugh and tell him it was a joke. When she didn't, he slowly set his cup down beside hers. "You're serious?" "I wouldn't be standing here making a fool of myself if I weren't," she said with a tight, tired smile. "I know how insane it sounds. Believe me." Evan crossed his arms too, mirroring her posture unconsciously. "Mind telling me why?" Olivia hesitated. For the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability pass over her polished features. She looked over her shoulder as if someone might be eavesdropping, then back at him. "My family," she said finally. "They're old money, big expectations. I've managed to avoid their meddling for years. But now," she exhaled sharply, "my father is retiring. He's announced that he's passing the company down to whichever child appears to have the most stable life." Evan frowned. "Stable meaning? Married?" "Exactly." She gave a humorless laugh. "It's absurd, but in my family, appearances mean everything. Stability equals marriage. A ring, a partner, a happy facade." "And you don't have a partner," Evan said, piecing it together. "Not even close," Olivia admitted. "And I don't have time to find someone real. The announcement party is next week. Everyone will be there. Press, shareholders, extended family. I can't show up alone without consequences." Evan scratched the back of his neck. "And you want me to pretend to be your husband?" "Yes." The garage filled with the soft hum of crickets outside, the faint clang of a loose shutter in the breeze. Evan's mind raced. Nothing about this situation made sense. Him, an oil-stained mechanic from a nowhere town, playing house with a woman who probably had more zeros in her bank account than he had in his entire lifetime. He shook his head slowly. "Miss Montgomery, I think you've got the wrong guy." Olivia stepped closer, her voice dropping to a gentle, persuasive tone. "You're exactly the right guy, Evan. I don't need someone slick or perfect. I need someone real. Someone who won't draw more attention than necessary. Someone I can trust for a week. He met her gaze, searching for any sign of mockery or deception. There was none. Only a quiet, desperate sincerity. "And what's in it for me?" he asked cautiously. Olivia didn't flinch. She pulled a folded envelope from her jacket pocket and set it on the workbench between them. Evan stared at it but didn't reach for it. "Enough to pay off your debts," she said softly. "Enough to keep your garage." The air left his lungs in a slow, disbelieving exhale. How could she know? "I asked Mrs. Donnelly about you while you were fixing the car," Olivia admitted, catching the flicker of surprise in his eyes. "This town's not exactly full of secrets." Evan pressed his fingers against the edge of the bench, grounding himself. It was tempting. God, it was more than tempting. It was salvation handed to him in an envelope. Still, something in him recoiled. "I don't like lying," he said gruffly. "I'm not asking you to lie," Olivia said. "I'm asking you to act. For 1 week. Pretend to be my husband. Wear a ring. Smile. Say a few things about how we met. Then when the week is over, you go back to your life. I'll go back to mine." He looked at the envelope again. At the garage behind him. At the peeling paint, the broken dreams barely held together with grit and grease. At his empty future without this place. He looked back at Olivia. She stood there, proud and fragile, all at once, offering him a strange kind of lifeline. "And what happens if someone figures it out?" he asked. "They won't," she said confidently, then a beat later softer. "But if they do, the worst that happens is embarrassment. Maybe I lose the company, but I won't drag you into it. I'll take full responsibility." The honesty in her voice chipped away at his last reservations. He rubbed his jaw, feeling the prickle of stubble there. It went against every instinct he had to step into someone else's charade. Yet wasn't life already a kind of charade? Pretending to be fine, pretending the past didn't haunt him, pretending dreams didn't ache when they died slow deaths. Maybe, just maybe, this strange detour was the closest thing to a second chance he was ever going to get. Finally, Evan pushed away from the workbench. "All right," he said. "I'll do it." Olivia's shoulders sagged slightly in relief. "Thank you, Evan. Truly. But," he added firmly, holding up a finger, "we lay down some ground rules." She arched an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "First," he said, ticking off on his fingers, "no funny business. This is a job. Strictly professional." "Agreed," Olivia said immediately. "Second, you don't try to change me into something I'm not. No fancy suits, no fake accents, no polishing me up like some prize pony." Her lips quirked upward. "Understood." "And third," Evan finished, his voice gentling, "once the week's over, we walk away. Clean break. No lingering." The smile faded from her face, replaced by something sadder, more solemn. She nodded once. "Clean break," she echoed. They shook hands, firm, binding. For a fleeting moment, Evan thought he felt a spark at the contact. He shook it off. Business. That's all this was. As Olivia turned to gather her things, Evan glanced up at the dark sky, the first stars just beginning to glimmer. Somewhere deep inside him, a quiet voice whispered that life was about to change in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. But Evan Carter had made a promise, and for a man like him, that meant everything. The next morning dawned crisp and golden over Willow Creek, the kind of early autumn day that smelled faintly of drying leaves and wood smoke. Evan stood outside Carter's repairs, arms crossed, watching as Olivia's sleek sedan pulled up once more, now fully repaired and humming like a contented cat. She stepped out, wearing jeans and a soft cream sweater this time. Still elegant, but less like a woman misplaced from a Manhattan boardroom, and more like someone who could almost belong in Willow Creek. "Morning," Evan said, tipping his cap slightly. "Morning," Olivia replied, flashing him a tentative smile that didn't quite mask her nerves. They stood in awkward silence for a beat, the enormity of what they had agreed to hanging between them like invisible static. "So," Evan said at last, clearing his throat, "you mentioned we need to rehearse." Olivia nodded, holding up a leather-bound notebook she had tucked under her arm. "We need a believable story. How we met, how we fell in love, details that match." Evan raised an eyebrow. "You wrote a script?" An outline, she corrected quickly, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Just enough so we're consistent if anyone asks. He chuckled lowly. You corporate types really don't leave anything to chance, do you? Not when the stakes are this high, she said simply, handing him a sheet of paper. Evan took it gingerly, scanning the neat bullet points. Met in New Hampshire at a car show. Bonded over a shared love of classic cars. First date, apple picking, and a picnic. Evan proposed under a maple tree last fall. He let out a whistle. Apple picking, huh? That's quaint. It needs to be charming, Olivia said. Relatable. Not flashy. Could have just said we met fixing a flat tire, he muttered. She smiled despite herself. This paints a better picture. Evan shook his head in amusement but conceded. All right, let's go through it. They moved inside the garage, sitting across from each other at a small wooden table Evan usually reserved for invoices and coffee breaks. The late morning sun streamed through the windows, bathing the dusty room in a kind of soft, forgiving light. Okay, Olivia began, pulling out 2 simple silver rings from a velvet pouch. First thing, we wear these. She slid one across the table to him. Evan hesitated for a fraction of a second before picking it up. It was lightweight, cool to the touch, utterly ordinary, and somehow the most peculiar thing he'd ever held. He slipped it onto his finger. It fit snugly, almost as if it belonged there. You're taking this very seriously, he remarked. If I don't, it'll fall apart at the first question, she said. Trust me, Evan. My family notices everything. Her voice softened a little, and Evan caught a flicker of old wounds in her eyes. He wondered just how many years she'd spent perfecting the art of looking unbreakable. All right, he said. So we met at a car show? In New Hampshire, Olivia confirmed. Last summer. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. What were you doing at a car show? My cousin dragged me, she said easily, as if she'd practiced the answer. I didn't know the first thing about engines. You offered to explain the difference between a carburetor and a fuel injector. Evan chuckled. That actually sounds like me. Exactly, Olivia said, looking pleased. And we went apple picking for our first date, he mused. Where? Macmillan Orchards, she answered without missing a beat. You packed a picnic. He smirked. I packed a picnic? You made ham sandwiches, Olivia said seriously, and brought lemonade. It was simple, sweet, very you. Evan laughed then, a warm, genuine sound that made Olivia's chest ache unexpectedly. He had a good laugh, rough-edged but golden somehow, like sunlight over gravel. You're good at this, he said. Her smile faltered just slightly. I've had a lot of practice pretending things are better than they are. The words hung heavy between them, raw and unvarnished. For the first time, Evan saw past the polished surface to the tired woman beneath. A woman who was fighting battles most people would never see. Something in him softened. Well, he said gruffly, for what it's worth, I'm lousy at pretending. So you might have to carry the team. I'll manage, she said, her voice lighter now. They spent the next hour going over the finer points. Olivia's favorite flower, dahlias. Evan's, he insisted it was a hot dog stand, just to make her roll her eyes. The make-believe story of their first Christmas together. The more they talked, the more the distance between them seemed to shrink, stitched closer by shared laughter and the easy rhythm of banter. At one point, Olivia laughed so hard she had to press a hand against her ribs. You're impossible, she gasped. And you're way too uptight, Evan countered, grinning. The walls she had so carefully built around herself seemed to slip, brick by brick, revealing a woman who could laugh until her eyes crinkled and who teased him mercilessly when he mixed up apple varieties. Outside, the day drifted toward afternoon. In here, in the garage that smelled of motor oil and coffee, something fragile and new was taking root, something neither of them dared name yet. Finally, Olivia stood, smoothing her jeans. I think we're ready, she said, or as ready as we'll ever be. Evan rose too, slipping the script outline into his pocket. One last thing, he said. She looked at him questioningly. If we're going to fool your family, he said slowly, we're going to have to get comfortable with things like holding hands, casual touches, eye contact. Olivia froze just for a second. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Without thinking too much about it, Evan reached out and took her hand. It was cool and delicate in his calloused grasp. She tensed, only briefly, then let out a slow breath and relaxed. Their eyes met. It was supposed to be practice. Just practice. But something flickered between them. Unwritten, unexpected, undeniable. Evan let go first, clearing his throat. See? Natural. Right, Olivia said, her voice a little too high. They stepped apart, pretending nothing had shifted in that moment. But in the silence that followed, both of them knew. This was no longer just about pretending. Something real, dangerous, beautiful, was beginning to stir. The drive to Olivia's family estate felt like stepping through a looking glass. Evan sat stiffly in the passenger seat of Olivia's sedan, his hands resting awkwardly on his lap. He wore the only blazer he owned, borrowed from Mrs. Donnelly's late husband, paired with his best jeans and a clean button-down shirt. His boots, scuffed but polished, tapped nervously against the floor mat. "You sure I don't need a tie?" he asked, tugging self-consciously at the collar of his shirt. Olivia smiled from behind the wheel, her eyes flickering to him with something almost fond. "You'll be perfect. Just be yourself." "Your family might not agree," Evan muttered. She laughed softly. "That's the point." He turned to look out the window as the scenery changed. The dusty charm of Willow Creek gave way to wide, sweeping roads lined with ancient oak trees. Immaculate fences framed rolling green hills, and in the distance, grand houses with pillars and manicured gardens stood like sentinels of old money and deeper secrets. Evan let out a low whistle. "I feel underdressed just looking at the lawns." "You'll do fine," Olivia said again, but there was a tightness in her voice now, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as him. The gates of the Montgomery estate loomed ahead, wrought iron and formidable. Olivia punched in a code, and they swung open with a slow, regal grace. Evan swallowed hard. The house beyond was less a home and more a castle, a sprawling Georgian manor with stone steps, marble columns, and windows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. Expensive cars lined the circular driveway, gleaming under the midday sun. Olivia parked off to the side and turned off the engine. She sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. "You okay?" Evan asked gently. She nodded, but her fingers were white against the leather. "Just remembering why I left." He didn't push. He just waited until she took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "Ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be," he replied. They got out of the car together. Before they reached the steps, Olivia slipped her hand into Evan's. An easy practice move after yesterday's rehearsal, but the jolt of contact still caught him off guard. She smiled up at him, whispering, "Remember, apple picking, ham sandwiches, maple tree." Evan nodded, squeezing her hand lightly in return. As they climbed the steps, the massive oak doors opened, and a flurry of activity swallowed them. Waitstaff in crisp black uniforms moved about with trays of champagne. The hall buzzed with conversation and laughter, the clink of glasses, the rich undercurrent of old money power plays. At the top of the stairs stood a woman in a navy dress, her posture as rigid as a ruler. Silver hair swept into a perfect chignon, a diamond necklace catching every light. "Mother," Olivia said smoothly, releasing Evan's hand just long enough to greet her. "Olivia," the woman replied with a nod that could have frozen lava. Her gaze flickered briefly to Evan, assessing, dissecting. "And you must be—" She trailed off. "Evan Carter," he said, extending his hand. There was the slightest hesitation before she shook it, her fingers cool and brittle as glass. Olivia slipped her arm through Evan's. "My husband." The word hung in the air like a firecracker before fading into polite, disbelieving silence. "Charming," her mother said at last, though the smile she offered was as warm as a January frost. They moved deeper into the house, meeting cousins, uncles, old family friends, all dressed to the nines, all carrying that air of effortless superiority that Evan found both bewildering and faintly ridiculous. He fumbled a few greetings, calling an older gentleman "Sir," only to be corrected with a brittle laugh. He nearly spilled champagne on a priceless Persian rug, and when asked about his career, he answered truthfully, "I fix engines," which earned a few thinly veiled looks of disdain. Still, Evan noticed something curious. While some recoiled from his plainness, others, especially the older guests, seemed to find him refreshing. He wasn't posturing. He wasn't jockeying for position. He just was. And somehow, that authenticity, so rare in rooms like this, made him stand out more than any designer suit could have. During a lull, Evan found himself out on the grand stone terrace overlooking acres of gardens. Olivia joined him, 2 glasses of punch in hand. "You're doing better than I expected," she said, handing him a glass. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment or a warning," he teased. She laughed, genuine and bright, and for a moment, the pretenses of the evening slipped away. "I mean it," she said. "You're real. They don't know what to do with real." Evan shrugged, taking a sip. "Nothing wrong with a little real in a world full of fake." They stood there a while, the late afternoon sun draping everything in honeyed light. Below them, guests drifted through the gardens like colorful paper boats. "You never really liked this world, did you?" Evan asked quietly. Olivia's smile faded, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the hedges and fountains. "It never really liked me." He didn't press. He simply stood beside her, offering his silent, steady presence, the kind of loyalty money couldn't buy. Inside, the sound of a piano began, a soft, lilting tune that beckoned guests back indoors for speeches and presentations. Olivia sighed, setting down her glass. Back into the fray. Before they turned, Evan caught her hand again, squeezing it gently. "You've got this," he said simply. She looked up at him, her eyes glinting with something fierce and grateful. Together, they stepped back into the mansion, hand in hand, facing a world neither of them fully belonged to, but facing it nonetheless, together. The grand hall buzzed with champagne and conversation, the chandeliers casting 1,000 fractured lights across polished marble floors. Evan stood near a buffet table laden with dishes he couldn't even name, balancing a plate of what looked like tiny, delicate sandwiches. He scanned the crowd, looking for Olivia. Instead, he found trouble. "You're the husband," a voice drawled beside him. Evan turned to see a man about his own age but far sleeker, dressed in a suit so sharp it could have cut glass. His hair was artfully tousled, his smile just a little too polished. "That's right," Evan said carefully. "Funny," the man mused, sipping from his glass. "Liv never mentioned you before." "Liv," Evan echoed, noting the familiar nickname. The man chuckled. "Cousin Marcus. We've known each other since we were kids." He extended a hand and Evan shook it, feeling the calculating squeeze behind the gesture. "So," Marcus said, swirling his drink lazily. "Where'd you two meet again?" "Car show in New Hampshire," Evan answered smoothly, recalling the rehearsed story. Marcus arched a brow. "Car show? Liv hates cars." Evan smiled easily. "Not after she met me." Marcus's mouth twitched, but it wasn't a smile. "Must have been one hell of a car show." "It was," Evan said simply, refusing to be rattled. Marcus studied him for a long, unsettling moment, then tipped his glass in a mock salute. "Welcome to the family, cousin." He drifted away into the crowd, leaving Evan with a sour taste in his mouth. It was nothing overt, no accusations, no outright hostility, but the message was clear. Marcus smelled something off, and if Marcus was sniffing around, it was only a matter of time before others did too. Evan set down his plate and scanned the room again, more urgently this time. He spotted Olivia near a group of older women, laughing lightly at something one of them said, though the tightness in her posture betrayed her nerves. Evan made his way over, catching her eye as he approached. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, slipping an arm around her waist with casual familiarity. She stiffened for a fraction of a second before melting into the role, leaning into him with a smile that could have fooled anyone. "Ladies," Evan nodded politely to the group, who all tittered behind their gloved hands. As they moved away from the cluster of guests, Olivia murmured, "Something wrong?" "Marcus," Evan said under his breath. "He's suspicious." Her smile didn't falter, but he felt her body tense beneath his touch. "I figured he'd be the first," she said quietly. "He's always been ambitious." "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said grimly. "If he can discredit me, he's next in line for the company." Evan exhaled slowly. "Great." Olivia squeezed his hand reassuringly. "We just have to stick to the story. Be natural. Be us." Us, Evan repeated wryly. She bumped his hip lightly with hers. You're doing great. Better than I hoped. He looked down at her, at the gleam of challenge and encouragement in her eyes, and for a moment he almost believed it was real. Not just a fragile illusion stitched together with borrowed memories and makeshift rings. Music swelled from the ballroom as a string quartet began to play, and couples drifted toward the dance floor. Olivia's mother appeared at their side, regal as ever. The first dance, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Tradition for newlyweds at their first family gathering. Olivia's smile froze. Evan squeezed her hand again. We'd be honored, he said, surprising himself as much as her. He led Olivia to the center of the floor. The music shifted into a slow, elegant waltz. Evan wasn't much for dancing. His idea of a dance floor involved sawdust, boots, and a country song. But he adapted, moving carefully, matching her rhythm. You're full of surprises, Olivia murmured. I aim to please, he said, guiding her into a slow turn. Around them, the polished elite watched with cool detachment, looking for cracks, for weaknesses. But Evan kept his eyes on Olivia. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or designer labels. There was a light in her tonight, a spark fighting its way through years of armor. You're good at this, she whispered. So are you, he said. She laughed softly, a sound that wrapped around him like a warm breeze. For a few minutes they weren't pretending. For a few minutes they were just a man and a woman moving together under 1,000 crystal lights, the world spinning away beyond the reach of their joined hands. When the dance ended, polite applause filled the hall. Olivia's mother nodded approvingly. Marcus watched with narrowed eyes, and Evan felt the weight of 100 stares settle once more on his shoulders. But when Olivia leaned up and pressed a kiss lightly to his cheek, just a brush, just a whisper of lips, Evan forgot about the watchers. He forgot about the lies. For a single blinding moment, he forgot everything except the startling, impossible truth. He wanted it to be real. The party wore on into the night, but Evan and Olivia slipped away long before the last champagne flute was drained. They found themselves on the back terrace, a quieter place where the manicured gardens gave way to open fields stretching out under the vast velvet sky. The marble steps were cool beneath them as they sat side by side, the distant laughter from the house growing fainter with each passing moment. Above them, the stars blinked awake one by one. Olivia kicked off her heels with a sigh of relief, wiggling her toes against the stone. I hate those things, she confessed, tipping her head back to stare at the stars. Evan chuckled. You hide it well. Years of practice, she said dryly. He studied her profile in the dim light, the strong line of her jaw, the graceful curve of her neck, the way the wind teased strands of her hair loose from their pins. Practice hiding what? He asked quietly. Olivia hesitated, then shrugged, a small, almost helpless motion. Everything, she said. Doubt, fear, disappointment. In my family, you're expected to wear success like armor. Show anything else and you're considered weak. Evan leaned back on his palms, staring up at the sky with her. The silence between them wasn't heavy this time. It was easy, filled with a strange kind of understanding. My old man used to say, Evan said slowly, that pretending you're fine is a full-time job. Harder than any honest day's work. Olivia smiled faintly. Smart man. He was, Evan agreed. Didn't always say much, but when he did, you listened. They sat like that for a long while, the cool night air brushing against their skin, the stars spinning silently overhead. Olivia turned to him, her voice softer now. What about you? What did you give up to stay in Willow Creek? Evan blew out a slow breath. College, engineering degree, dreams of building things that'd last longer than I would. He gave a wry smile. But after my parents died, Sarah needed someone, and I figured some dreams were worth trading for others. Olivia studied him, something tender flickering in her gaze. You don't regret it? Some days, Evan admitted honestly, but mostly, no. I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd left her behind. He shrugged. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't glamorous. It's just necessary. Olivia looked down at her hands folded in her lap, her fingers twisting the simple silver ring she wore. Necessary, she echoed. There was a weight behind the word, a sorrow Evan didn't pry into. He just waited. After a long moment, Olivia whispered, "My father doesn't really want a successor. He wants a mirror, someone who will make him proud in the ways he understands. Power, control, image. And you?" Evan asked gently. "I want a life that feels like mine," she said fiercely, her voice breaking around the edges. "Not a parade I'm marching in because it's expected." She blinked rapidly, tilting her head back to stare hard at the stars. Evan shifted closer, their knees brushing. "You ever think about just walking away?" he asked. "Every day," she said with a shaky laugh. "Then why stay?" Olivia wrapped her arms around herself, as if warding off a chill only she could feel. "Because walking away would mean giving it all to people like Marcus," she said. "People who see legacy as a weapon, not a gift." Her eyes met his, fierce and vulnerable all at once. "I want to change things, make it better. I don't know if I'm strong enough." Evan didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her she could do it or that everything would be fine. Instead, he said the only thing that mattered. "You're not alone in it anymore," he said simply. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. The warmth of his words wrapping around her more surely than any expensive coat ever could. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his without hesitation this time. "No matter what happens next week," Olivia said quietly, "promise me one thing." Evan squeezed her hand. "Name it." "Don't pretend with me," she whispered. "Everyone else might, but not you. I need at least one person in my life who's real." He turned to her fully then, his free hand brushing a stray lock of hair from her face with a tenderness that startled them both. "I promise," he said. No rehearsed lines, no act, just two broken, stubborn souls finding something solid in each other. The door creaked somewhere behind them, voices filtering into the night, but they stayed where they were, unwilling to break the fragile peace they'd carved out beneath the stars. For the first time in a long, long while, Olivia didn't feel like she was pretending. And for the first time in longer, Evan wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't fixing someone else's broken dream. Maybe he was finally stepping into one of his own. The days that followed blurred into a strange kind of dream. Each morning, Evan and Olivia woke in adjacent guest rooms of the sprawling Montgomery estate, sharing breakfast under the skeptical gazes of relatives who couldn't quite believe in the couple's whirlwind romance. Each afternoon was filled with meetings, luncheons, and endless rounds of polite scrutiny. Through it all, they played their parts to perfection, or so everyone thought. In truth, the line between pretending and reality was beginning to erode, soft and unnoticed, like a tide wearing down the sharp edges of stone. One crisp afternoon, Olivia pulled Evan into the sun-drenched gardens under the pretense of a private stroll. Their hands brushed lightly as they walked along gravel paths lined with late-blooming roses. "You have to stop doing that," she said, glancing sideways at him. "Doing what?" he asked innocently. "Smiling at me like—" She trailed off, flushing slightly. "Like I mean it?" Evan teased. Olivia huffed, pretending exasperation, but her eyes sparkled. "It's confusing," she admitted under her breath. "For who?" he asked, slowing his steps. "For both of us," she said, barely louder than the rustling leaves. They stopped under an ancient oak tree, its branches casting dappled patterns across the ground. Evan leaned against the rough bark, folding his arms across his chest. "We said no lines," he reminded her gently. "I know," Olivia said. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture he'd come to recognize. "But sometimes it feels so easy. Too easy." Evan tilted his head, studying her. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." She looked up at him, then, really looked, and for a heartbeat, the space between them pulsed with something electric, something real. Olivia stepped back first, shaking her head as if to clear it. "We should get back," she said. "Yeah," Evan agreed, though neither of them moved right away. Later that evening, a bonfire was lit in the back gardens, an annual family tradition meant to mark the changing seasons. Guests gathered around, sipping cider and trading stories as the flames crackled and threw sparks into the star-dusted sky. Evan found himself perched on a log beside Olivia, a plaid blanket draped over their shoulders. She shivered slightly in the cooling air, and instinctively he pulled her closer. She didn't resist. Tell me something real, she said suddenly, her voice low, meant only for him. Evan smiled into the firelight. What? Like a confession? She nodded, her cheek brushing against his shoulder. He thought for a moment, then said, Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I hadn't stayed in Willow Creek. If I'd gone off and chased the big dreams. Olivia lifted her head to look at him, her expression open, curious. And, she prompted, and then I look around, he said, his voice steady, at all the things I would have missed. And I realize, what I have isn't flashy, but it's real. It matters. He turned his head, meeting her gaze fully. You matter, he added quietly. The world seemed to tilt slightly, the fire fading into a blur at the edges of his vision. Olivia's breath caught, and for a moment, Evan thought she might lean in, might close the aching distance between them. Instead, she buried her face against his shoulder, a tremulous laugh escaping her. You're dangerous, she whispered. He chuckled, resting his chin lightly atop her head. You have no idea. The next day brought errands into town. A public appearance carefully orchestrated to solidify their love story in the eyes of nosy acquaintances and curious reporters. They walked hand in hand down the cobbled streets, sharing ice cream cones from a local parlor. Evan offered Olivia a taste of his rocky road. She wrinkled her nose and stole a bigger bite than necessary, laughing when he protested. An older woman passing by leaned in and whispered to her friend, Young love, isn't it beautiful? Olivia caught Evan's eye and blushed furiously. He winked at her, and she laughed, a sound so free, so unguarded, that Evan felt something inside him crack open. They weren't pretending anymore, at least not completely. That night, back at the estate, Evan found Olivia sitting alone on the veranda, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling night. He joined her without a word, handing her a mug of steaming tea. Peace offering, he said. For what? She asked, amused. For the ice cream theft, he said solemnly. She laughed, curling her fingers around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her bones. Today felt, she hesitated. Real, Evan finished for her. Yeah, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It did. They sat in comfortable silence, sipping tea, watching the moon rise over the fields. Evan wanted to say something, to ask her if maybe, just maybe, they could keep pretending a little longer, even after the deal was done. But he stayed quiet, because deep down he knew the pretending was already over. And what scared him more was that he didn't want it to be. The annual Montgomery Gala was an event woven into the very fabric of Olivia's family history. A glittering evening of polished silver, orchestras, and whispered power plays, cloaked in champagne smiles. Tonight it felt like a noose tightening around Evan's neck. He stood near the grand staircase, dressed in a tailored suit Olivia had insisted he wear. It wasn't custom-made, but he cleaned up well, if the approving glances from passing guests were any indication. Olivia hovered nearby, radiant in a dark green gown that made her look both regal and heartbreakingly real. For the first time in days, Evan didn't have to fake anything. He watched her, felt a strange tug in his chest at the way she laughed easily now, the way her eyes searched for his across the room like he was some kind of anchor in the swirling chaos. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to hurt. The announcement ceremony was scheduled for later in the evening. Olivia's father would name his successor in front of the family, the board members, and the press. Olivia had done everything right. Evan had played his part. They were so close to pulling it off. Too close. Enjoying yourself, Mr. Carter? A voice drawled behind him. Evan turned to find Marcus, drink in hand, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Having a fine time, thanks, Evan said easily. Marcus's smile widened. I'm sure you are. Sagrafhom. He clinked his glass against Evan's with mock cheer. Tell me, did you always dream of marrying into a fortune, or was it just a lucky break? Evan stiffened but kept his face neutral. I didn't marry Olivia for her money. No, Marcus said, his voice silky. You married her after meeting her at a car show, right? Evan's jaw tightened. Marcus leaned in slightly. Funny thing about that story. You see, I did a little digging. Evan said nothing, feeling the air around him grow heavy. And guess what? Marcus continued, smiling wider. There was no record of any car show in New Hampshire last summer. None. Not a single one. A chill slid down Evan's spine. Marcus straightened, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate casualness. "I wonder," he said lightly, loud enough for a few nearby guests to overhear, "what else isn't real about your little love story?" Heads turned. Conversations faltered. The soft clink of glass on glass seemed suddenly too loud. Across the room, Olivia sensed it. She excused herself hastily from her group and made her way toward them, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. "What's going on?" she demanded. Marcus turned to her, all mock innocence. "Just getting to know the newest member of the family better," he said. "Did you know, Liv, that Evan here can't seem to recall which car show you two met at? Or when?" Olivia's face paled, but she recovered quickly. "Of course I do," she said smoothly. "It was a small private event, not one that's publicly listed." Marcus arched a skeptical eyebrow. "Convenient." Murmurs rippled through the nearby guests. Evan caught snippets. Fraud, gold digger, scandal. Olivia stepped closer to Evan, slipping her arm through his in a silent gesture of solidarity. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Her father approached then, drawn by the sudden shift in energy. His sharp blue eyes took in the scene, the awkward silence, the way Olivia clung to Evan like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. "What is happening here?" he asked, his voice cold enough to freeze the room. Marcus stepped forward smoothly. "I was merely expressing some concerns, Uncle, about the authenticity of this marriage." "Concerns?" her father repeated, his gaze pinning Olivia and Evan both. Evan opened his mouth to defend her, but Olivia spoke first. "There's nothing inauthentic about our marriage," she said firmly. "Evan and I," her voice faltered for the briefest second, and Marcus pounced, "have known each other for what? A few months, weeks? Long enough to stage a fairy tale, but not long enough to remember your own story." The words sliced through the air, cutting deeper than any blade. Olivia's father looked between them, reading too much in the silence that followed. His lips thinned. "We'll discuss this later. Privately." The orchestra faltered, the music stumbling like a wounded thing. Conversation resumed in polite, brittle threads, but the spell had been broken. Evan felt Olivia trembling beside him, even as she lifted her chin in defiance. "You okay?" he murmured. She nodded once, the motion tight, brittle. But he knew she wasn't. Neither was he. Later, in the privacy of the vast guest wing, Evan paced the length of his borrowed room, hands raking through his hair. The lie had cracked open, and there was no stitching it neatly back together. He heard a soft knock and turned to find Olivia standing in the doorway, barefoot, her gown trailing behind her like fallen ivy. Her eyes shone with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Evan shook his head. "It's not your fault." "It is," she insisted. "I dragged you into this." He crossed the room in 2 strides, cupping her face gently between his hands. "You didn't drag me anywhere," he said. "I walked in with my eyes open." She covered his hands with hers, clinging. "I just wanted one thing," Olivia said brokenly. "One thing that was mine. Something good. Something real." Evan's heart twisted painfully. "You still have it," he said fiercely. "You have me." She closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek. "But it's not real," she whispered. Evan leaned his forehead against hers, his voice a low, rough promise. "It feels real enough to me." They stood there, wrapped in the rawness of everything they hadn't meant to feel. Pretending had never been harder, or more impossible to stop. The bus ride back to Willow Creek was a long, punishing blur. Evan sat by the window, his duffel bag at his feet, watching the scenery unravel like an old familiar film. Golden fields, sagging barns, winding dirt roads, all the quiet hallmarks of a life he'd never truly left behind. And yet somehow everything looked different now, smaller, duller, as if something inside him had cracked open and emptied out, leaving him hollow. He shifted in his seat, resting his forehead against the cool glass. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, staining the sky in bruised purples and golds. He barely noticed. All he could see was Olivia, her tearful eyes, the way her voice had broken when she said, "But it's not real." The way he had wanted, more than anything, to tell her it was, that it was the truest thing he'd ever known. But the lie they'd built between them however fragile, however well-intentioned, had collapsed under its own weight, leaving only wreckage in its place. Willow Creek welcomed him back with its familiar dust and weary charm. The garage looked exactly as he'd left it, peeling blue paint, cracked windows, the old Carter's Repair sign hanging crookedly above the door. It should have felt like coming home. Instead, it felt like exile. Evan unlocked the door and stepped inside, the scent of oil and metal wrapped around him like an old worn-out blanket. He tossed his duffel onto the workbench and stood there for a long time, breathing in the silence. The phone sat silent on the counter. No messages, no calls, no reason to expect otherwise. With a heavy sigh, Evan pulled off his jacket and got to work. Not because there was anything urgent to fix, there wasn't, but because work was the only thing left that made any sense. He lost himself in the familiar rhythm of repair, checking spark plugs, changing filters, tightening bolts. His hands moved automatically, but his mind wasn't fooled. Everywhere he turned, he saw her, Olivia laughing as she stole his ice cream. Olivia pretending to hate apple picking, but secretly enjoying it. Olivia barefoot under the stars, whispering promises she hadn't meant to break. By the time darkness fell completely, Evan sat slumped against the garage wall, grease-streaked and exhausted in every sense of the word. He scrubbed his hands over his face and whispered into the emptiness. "You were real to me," but there was no one there to hear it. Meanwhile, 3 states away, Olivia stood in the cavernous glass lobby of Montgomery Enterprises, feeling every inch the fraud she had spent her life pretending not to be. The city pulsed around her, bright, busy, indifferent. People streamed past, voices echoing off marble and chrome, their lives brimming with purpose. Olivia felt utterly, unbearably lost. She clenched the portfolio in her hands, a strategic plan for the company's future, neatly outlined, flawlessly presented, everything her father had ever wanted, everything she no longer cared about. "Miss Montgomery," her assistant appeared, polite and polished. "The board meeting is ready for you." Olivia forced a smile and nodded. She moved mechanically through the corridors, heels clicking sharply on the floor, back straight, chin lifted. The perfect image of control. And yet as she entered the boardroom, as she stood at the head of the gleaming mahogany table and launched into her presentation, she felt the hollowness gnawing at her from the inside out. Numbers, charts, projections. None of it mattered. Not when she could still hear Evan's voice in her mind, low and certain. "You matter." She finished the meeting with practiced ease, fielded a few token questions, accepted the polite applause, but when she returned to her office, she closed the door quietly behind her, leaned back against it, and let herself slide to the floor. For the first time in years, Olivia Montgomery, the woman who could outwit billionaires, who could negotiate mergers before breakfast, pressed her forehead to her knees and wept like a child. Not for the company, not for the shattered facade, but for a man who had seen her, not as a prize or a pawn, but as a person. And she had let him go, because she had been too afraid to believe in something that couldn't be measured or controlled, too afraid to believe in love. Days passed. In Willow Creek, Evan buried himself in repairs, fixing everything but the broken thing inside him. In New York, Olivia attended meeting after meeting, wearing her brightest masks while feeling like a ghost behind them. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them reached out. Pride, pain, fear. They built walls thicker than any city skyline or dusty country road. But sometimes, late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, Evan would find himself staring at the stars outside the garage, wondering if Olivia was looking at the same sky. And sometimes, in the cold glass towers of the city, Olivia would trace the simple silver ring she still wore on a chain around her neck, hidden but not forgotten, and wonder if Evan had already moved on. They had promised a clean break, but the heart, stubborn and reckless, had never agreed to the terms. And neither of them could shake the terrible, aching certainty that something precious was slipping away. Something real, something irreplaceable, something worth fighting for. Olivia Montgomery had always known how to leave a room. She could glide out of board meetings, exit galas, vanish from uncomfortable conversations with the effortless poise of a woman trained to slip past confrontation. But nothing in her carefully orchestrated life had prepared her for walking away from everything. And yet here she was, standing in the center of her office, a resignation letter on the polished oak desk behind her, keys clutched tightly in her fist, heart hammering with a wild, reckless hope she could no longer deny. "You're making a mistake," her father had said, cold fury etched into every syllable. Maybe she was, but for the first time, it would be her mistake. Not a script written by generations of expectations. Not a performance for shareholders or family. Her life. Her choice. She drove herself out of the city, refusing the offer of a driver, leaving behind the high-rises and mirrored walls, the endless clamor of ambition. The highway stretched ahead, a silver ribbon unspooling under an endless blue sky. It wasn't until she crossed the state line into Vermont that the tightness in her chest began to ease. The further she drove, the more the world softened. Fields of wildflowers swaying in the late afternoon breeze, old farmhouses leaning with the weight of decades, children chasing each other across gravel roads. It was messy, unpolished, real. Everything she hadn't known she was longing for until she met Evan Carter. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel as his face flashed in her mind. The easy grin, the rough kindness in his hands, the way he had seen her even when she had been too afraid to see herself. She only prayed it wasn't too late. The sun dipped low when Olivia's GPS finally led her into Willow Creek. It was exactly as Evan had described. A single main street lined with weathered shops, a diner with faded red booths, a garage that leaned slightly to the left as if tired from standing too long against the wind. Carter's repairs. Her heart stuttered at the sight of it. The garage door was closed, but the open sign hung lopsided in the window. Olivia parked across the street, shutting off the engine with a trembling hand. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at the building. What if he wouldn't see her? What if she had shattered something too fragile to mend? No, she hadn't come this far to let fear stop her. She stepped out of the car, her heels sinking slightly into the dusty gravel. She crossed the street slowly, every step heavy with hope and terror. The bell above the door jingled as she pushed it open. Inside, the scent of motor oil and worn leather wrapped around her like a memory. The garage was dimly lit, cluttered with tools and spare parts. A radio played faintly in the background, some old country ballad full of heartbreak and steel guitars. And there, bent over the open hood of a battered pickup, was Evan. For a second, she couldn't breathe. He hadn't seen her yet. He wore a faded gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair mussed, grease staining his hands. He looked exactly like she remembered. Rough around the edges, heartbreakingly solid. "Be right with you," he called without looking up. Olivia's throat closed. She opened her mouth, and then somehow found her voice. "I'm not here for a repair." The wrench in Evan's hand clattered to the floor. He straightened slowly, turning toward her. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Evan's face was a careful blank, but she saw the flicker of shock, the guarded hope he tried to hide. "Liv," he said hoarsely. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps, stopping just short of him. "I left," she said. "The company, the city, all of it." He stared at her, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "Why?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "Because none of it mattered," she said. "Not without you." Evan's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You don't owe me anything." "I'm not here because I owe you," she said fiercely. "I'm here because I love you." The words hung there, raw and terrifying. For a long moment, Evan said nothing. The ticking of a cooling engine was the only sound between them. Then finally he moved. He crossed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. Olivia went willingly, bearing her face against his chest, breathing in the clean, familiar scent of him. "You're real," she whispered against his shirt. He laughed, a rough, choked sound, and tightened his arms around her. "So are you," he murmured. They stood there clinging to each other, two stubborn souls who had finally found their way home. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And for Evan and Olivia, real was more than enough. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, a velvet canvas dusted with a million trembling lights. Olivia and Evan sat in the back of his old pickup, the truck bed lined with a faded quilt that smelled faintly of sun and soap. They leaned against the cab, legs stretched out, the quiet symphony of crickets and distant frogs filling the cool country air. Neither spoke at first. There was no need. The silence between them was no longer brittle, no longer strained. It was soft now, woven with the kind of understanding that only came when two people had seen each other at their worst and stayed anyway. Olivia pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, glancing sideways at Evan. He sat with one arm draped over the side of the truck, his face turned upward, a small, wistful smile playing on his lips. The silver ring she had returned to him earlier tonight glinted faintly in the moonlight, now resting once again on his hand where it belonged. "Tell me," Olivia said finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Tell me why you didn't chase me." Evan didn't look at her right away. His gaze remained fixed on the stars. "Because," he said slowly, "you deserve to choose." She frowned. "I don't understand." He turned then, meeting her eyes fully, and Olivia felt the ground shift under her. "I couldn't be another person who boxed you in," Evan said. "You had to want this, want us. Not because it was easier, not because it was expected, but because it was yours." His voice was rough, raw, in a way that tore at her heart. "You think I didn't want to?" he continued, a humorless laugh escaping him. "You think I didn't want to get in that truck and drive straight to New York? Pull you out of those glass towers and tell you to come home with me?" He shook his head, looking away. "I wanted it so bad it hurt," he admitted, "but I wanted your happiness more." Olivia's throat ached with the force of unshed tears. "I thought you didn't care," she said, her voice cracking. He gave a small, sad smile. "I cared too much." She reached out then, her fingers finding his in the dark, tangling them together. "I was scared," she whispered. "Not of you, not of us, of what it meant to finally want something that didn't come with guarantees." Evan squeezed her hand gently. "Nothing real ever does." The words settled between them like a promise. Olivia shifted closer until her head rested against his shoulder. She closed her eyes, letting herself breathe him in. The warm scent of leather and soap and something uniquely Evan. For a long time they sat there, the stars spinning silently overhead. When Olivia finally spoke again, her words were steady, certain. "I love you, Evan Carter." He stiffened almost imperceptibly, and for a terrifying second, she wondered if she'd said too much, too soon. But then he turned, cradling her face between his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears she hadn't realized had fallen. "And I love you, Olivia Montgomery," he said, his voice breaking on her name like a prayer. "I love you in a way I didn't think I had left in me." The dam broke then, and Olivia laughed through her tears, the sound shaky but radiant. "You're a stubborn, impossible man," she said. He grinned, that familiar, heart-stopping grin that had undone her from the very start. "Takes one to love one," he said, and then he kissed her. Not with the desperation of a man clinging to a dream, but with the deep, quiet certainty of someone who had finally found home. The kiss was slow, reverent, a blending of promises and forgiveness, and the fierce, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something lasting from the wreckage of their mistakes. When they finally broke apart, forehead to forehead, breath mingling in the cool night air, Olivia smiled. "So what now?" she asked, voice trembling with wonder. Evan leaned back, studying her with a look so tender it stole her breath away. "Now," he said, "we start for real. No pretending, no running." He laced their fingers together, squeezing lightly. "Just you and me, one day at a time." Olivia nodded, blinking back the sting of fresh tears. "I can do that," she whispered. They lay back against the quilt, side by side, their hands clasped between them, hearts beating in a new rhythm. Above them, the stars spun their ancient, silent stories. But tonight, somewhere in the great wild tapestry of the world, a new story had begun. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And for Evan and Olivia, that was more than enough. It was everything. 6 months later, the town of Willow Creek bloomed under the golden kiss of spring. The main street buzzed with gentle life, neighbors chatting over picket fences, the scent of fresh-cut grass lingering in the air, children racing down sidewalks chalked in pastel rainbows. At the corner of Maple and Fir stood a site that had become quietly beloved in the town, Carter's Garage and Cafe. The garage still bore its original weathered sign, now lovingly restored, but next to it a new awning fluttered in the breeze. A cheerful green canvas that read, Olivia's Place, in curling white letters. Inside, the little cafe bustled with a steady rhythm. Fresh coffee brewed behind the counter. Plates of warm blueberry muffins and homemade pies lined the glass display. The hum of easy conversation filled the air. Evan stood behind the garage partition, hands deftly working under the hood of an old pickup. Grease smudged the edge of his jaw, and his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. He looked perfectly at home among the tools and the laughter, the smell of coffee and motor oil weaving together into something improbably sweet. From the cafe window, Olivia watched him, her heart swelling in that quiet, aching way it always did now. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and stepped outside, the tiny brass bell above the door chiming a soft greeting. Evan straightened when he saw her, grinning that slow, lazy grin that had once undone her, and still did. "Need something, Mrs. Carter?" he teased, wiping his hands on a rag. Olivia's cheeks warmed pleasantly at the title. They had married in a small ceremony 2 months ago, surrounded by a few close friends, Mrs. Donnelly crying happy tears into a lace handkerchief. It hadn't been grand. It hadn't been planned for months. It had been perfect. She crossed the small distance between them, reaching up to smooth a smear of grease from his cheek with her thumb. "You're a mess," she said fondly. "You love it," he replied, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I do," she whispered. There was no doubt in her voice now, no fear, only certainty built from the ashes of all they had survived. They stood there a moment, wrapped in the soft buzz of the town around them, the world continuing to spin in its easy, forgiving way. "You know," Evan said, tugging her closer, "when I first imagined a future, I never thought it would look like this." Olivia rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady thrum of his heartbeat. "Neither did I," she admitted, "and it's better than anything I ever planned." He chuckled. "You, giving up a plan? That's serious." She smiled against him. "Sometimes the best things happen when you stop planning and just live." Evan tilted her chin up, studying her face like it was a map to every good thing he had ever wanted. "You saved me," he said quietly. Olivia shook her head. "We saved each other." And they had. Saved each other from loneliness, from fear, from a lifetime of pretending. They had built something real from broken dreams and stubborn hope, piece by fragile piece. Later that evening, as twilight painted the sky in streaks of lavender and gold, Evan and Olivia sat on the front steps of the garage, a thermos of coffee between them. Fireflies danced lazily over the grass. A warm breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and wild honeysuckle. Evan laced his fingers through Olivia's, squeezing lightly. "You ever think about what would have happened if your car hadn't broken down that day?" he asked. Olivia laughed softly. "I would have kept driving, kept pretending I was fine, kept missing the best thing that ever happened to me." Evan turned to her, his eyes steady and sure. "I think life has a way of breaking down exactly when it needs to." She smiled, tears pricking her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming, quiet joy of it all. "You're my miracle, Evan Carter," she whispered. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, his voice rumbling against her skin. "And you're my home, Olivia Montgomery Carter." They sat there long after the sun disappeared, watching the stars bloom overhead, hearts full in a way neither had known possible. They had lost and found each other, broken and mended, pretended and finally truly loved. And as the first notes of Cricket's song rose into the evening, the lights from Carter's garage and cafe glowed warmly against the gathering night. A beacon of hope, of second chances, of a love that had started as a lie and become the most beautiful truth either had ever known. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Drop us a comment below and share your thoughts about the story. You are part of what makes this community so special. If you enjoyed this heartwarming journey, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing and hitting the notification bell, you'll never miss a story that brings hope, inspiration, and a little magic into your life. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Your support means the world, and we can't wait to share more beautiful stories with you. Until next time, take care and keep believing in the power of love and kindness.